Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you all to this session. And we are very grateful to have Dr. Iraj Abedian from South Africa as our honored guest speaker with us tonight. As you are aware, Iraj will have a presentation about our collective future beyond and because of COVID-19 tonight. I should say I know Iraj for so many years, as our families were neighbors in Iran in the city of Kashan. Dr. Iraj Abedian is the founder and executive chairman of Pan-African Capital Holdings. He is graduate of Tehran University, obtained his master's degree from University of Cape Town and his Ph.D. in economics from Simon Fraser University in Canada in 1993. He was professor of economics at the University of Cape Town before entering the business sector in 2000, joining Standard Bank of South Africa as the Group Chief Economist. During September to December 1999, Iraj was based at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, Washington, D.C., working on issues related to fiscal vulnerability assessment. He has had extensive involvement in economic and financial policy making in post-apartheid South Africa since 1994. He remains actively involved in public policy discourses at the national and international levels. Iraj pioneered to South Africa in 1980 and has been active in Baha'i community life at the local and national levels, including the membership of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of South Africa during 1984 to 89 and 1998 to 2005. Please help me to welcome Dr. Iraj. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akram, for those kind words and for inviting me. It is indeed a great privilege for me to have this opportunity to not just share some ideas, but also to connect with so many dear friends from many, many decades back, figuratively from last century. It is also wonderful to experience in our lifetime how so many of the boundaries and barriers have shattered in front of us as a result of a very painful, traumatic, and to some extent unexpected global crisis caused by the coronavirus. Over the past 5 months, we have seen right around the globe a phenomenon that we have never seen as a human being, never experienced before. We have had crises, we've had wars, we've had all kinds of even pandemics in the past, but never ever before have such crises been so global, so universal in their impact on human beings. If you look at the biggest crisis that we've had, the Second World War, it really affected less than 40% of the population of the Earth. It was a war between the Europeans primarily, including Japan and the United States subsequently. But the majority of the human beings at that time were roughly and were generally unaffected. And yet, over the past 5 months, we have seen that over 90% of the global economy, and nowadays 100% of it, no matter how big, how small, no matter how developed or underdeveloped, whether in the West or the East or the Middle East, have been affected adversely. And it's important to note that we have not yet finished the crisis. We are in the middle of the crisis. It's an unfolding process that, quite frankly, nobody knows the end. We know the process. And in that process, and with regard to the process, I'll share some thoughts. It is important to note that after 5 months of tackling the crisis the way that we have done, as we speak, an estimated 200 million people have lost their jobs. If you think that for every job lost, for every enterprise that's gone either out of business or suffering as a result, on average 5 or 6, sometimes more people are affected. So 200 million people losing their jobs on its own means 1 billion people at the moment and up to now adversely affected. As a result, we have seen a very unfortunate, traumatic fear, anxiety, uncertainty engulfing the entire human community. The rich and the poor have suddenly found themselves in the same boat, figuratively speaking. Neither their wealth, nor their armies, nor their institutions of government have proven to be sufficient or prepared or fit for purpose, if you like. So over the past 5 months, not only as human beings we have experienced the trauma, the pain, and some of us the loss, the mourning of those who have lost their lives. And we need to by no means underestimate that part of our human community have suffered very, very painfully. And yet we've also recognized that as human communities, if the entire human socio-economic system, political system, institutional system, as a whole, if it was a human body, we suddenly realized that before January, before the coronavirus, this body had immunity problems. It had a lot of predispositions, a lot of fault in its systems of governance, in its systems of resource allocation, in its system of economic structuring, financial structuring, as well as political structuring with regard to national as well as international governance of human affairs. So let's begin with economics, which is my field of studies, and I remain a student of this field. We have seen for the first time close to 70% of the global economy voluntarily, and as they call it, force majeure, was brought to a closure. Businesses like airlines, like hotels, tourism industry, and a whole host of associated services on the logistics and the supply side, supply chains, they have been brought to a voluntary halt out of fear, out of anxiety, out of just not knowing what to do. So we have forced from the United States to China, from China to Africa, and everywhere else that we look at, a very voluntary, fear-driven closure of our economic activities. Note that during the Second World War, we did not close businesses. We did not shut the economy. We converted some factories from building whatever they were making to building boots, guns, and uniforms for soldiers, or bullets and guns. But we did not shut the economy down. We did not hide in our homes and forced to stay outside our community, which is, after all, the essence of human life, is to be gregarious, to be social, to connect, have gatherings. And yet religious, socio-economic, sport, every other activity, every other gathering has been brought to a halt. So our economy has proven vulnerable to these sudden immunity problems in the system of socio-economic structuring. If we look at our system from a political point of view, and of course politics and economics are interrelated, inseparable, we have seen that all systems of governance in the East and the West, whether they were capitalist, socialist, communist, populist, whatever their label that they put on themselves, they've proven to be inadequate and unfit to manage the crisis. They have proven to be unfit to take care of the welfare of their nations. And we can see that at the moment, although the crisis is not finished, almost every single society is fractured in terms of their political perceptions, political ideologies, and political viewpoints. For example, should we open the economy in order to preserve livelihood, or should we keep the economy shut, social distances, in order to preserve lives? So that debate is everywhere, from Iran to Mexico, from Muslim to Buddhist, from Hindu to Christian societies. It has crushed all those boundaries. So it's no longer an issue of the East and the West, it's an issue of humanity. How do we strike a balance between preserving livelihood and preserving lives? And that is not just simply a medical issue. That is not simply an economic issue or a financial policy issue or a political issue. It's a much wider systemic issue. I'll come back to this point. So from a political point of view, we see a kind of fermentation, we see a kind of argumentation in all economic systems, in all political systems. Even within political parties at times, within the same country, the political party, whether they are right-wing or left-wing, whether Labour or Democrat, liberal or otherwise, they have divisions amongst themselves because they cannot agree on how to go about preserving lives and preserving livelihoods at the same time. New challenges, interesting issues that we will come back to. So over the past 5 months, not only our economy has brought to a halt, but our politics has also been brought to a halt, all across ideological divides. So in a very negative way, out of fear and out of anxiety, humanity suddenly has found some kind of unity in fear, unity in uncertainty, unity in not knowing how to organize their politics, how to agree on various norms of running the society. If you look at our global trade and our global organizations more broadly, we see a similar type of fractures, fault lines, and at times controversies, argumentations, and confrontations out of fear and out of not knowing what to do. When you don't know how to govern, and when an issue comes back, the knee-jerk reaction of politicians in China, in the United States, in Europe, and in the Middle East is to go short-term, to look at their own self-interest, not social interest. Therefore, they find somebody else to blame. As we speak, we see China is blaming the United States is blaming China, United States and some European countries are blaming the World Health Organization, others are blaming the United Nations. So the blame game is in part driven by the fact that people do not want to deal with the real issues of our economic, political, and social system. They do not want to acknowledge that even without the crisis, even without the coronavirus, our human community at the global and national and regional level had serious immunity problems. It did not take issues of the environmental sustainability seriously. Some ignored it. It did not take the humanities and particularly national and international human rights seriously. We had minorities in all societies suffering in silence and being ignored. And unfortunately, we see the flaring of racism in the United States, unfortunately, as we speak. Over the past 48 hours, we've had another incident. In other parts of the world, and where I am in Africa, we've had this systemically over the past 100 years or so. We note that all these issues that were real crises of people suffering in silence, either women in their abuse of their rights, in their lack of recognition for equal socio-political, not just right, ability, capability, ignored decade after decade, possibly over a century after Baha'u'llah, as we all know, back in 1867 and thereabout, Baha'u'llah highlighted to the rulers of the time, to the kings and emperors, to the popes and the religious leaders, that these are the internal systemic immunity problems of human socio-economic system, political system. And unless and until these immunity issues are dealt with, the society will go from vulnerable to more vulnerable, to less sustainable and more fragile. And of course, as we all know, over the past 140 years, these insights, these warnings have been ignored. Of course, for us as Baha'is, it's quite clear that in the tablets that Baha'u'llah wrote to the rulers of the time, and these were, interestingly enough, 100 years later, on the centenary of those revelations of those tablets, the Universal House of Justice reissued these tablets in a compilation that I'm sure you have seen under the proclamation of Baha'u'llah to the kings and the rulers and the religious leaders. All these issues were highlighted, and I'll refer to some of them very shortly. That the resources of the societies and the organizations of governance, both nationally and internationally, need to be so structured as to be A, conducive to the welfare of the society, and B, to be fair and equitable. What we have seen since then, two wars, we have seen over 200 socio-economic crises that have come and gone, and time and again, us as humanity, we have ignored the fundamental systemic vulnerabilities that socio-economic, political, and financial systems of the globe have continued to live with and to go from bad to worse. So we have seen not only the economic, the environmental issues becoming serious, we have seen financial crisis, we have seen economic crisis, we have seen crisis of human rights, we have seen continuous and a broadening and a widening of crisis of women's abuse, as well as children, as well as youth, and so on and so on. So all these embedded systemic crises were suddenly burst open as a result of the coronavirus crisis. We have seen that, for example, those who are most suffering the consequences of the virus are the minorities, those who are less taken care of. We have seen that countries had resources, but those resources were not used to be able to respond to such crises. Although we have, at the same time, on the positive side, we've seen that under the political, socio-political pressures, some governments, not all of them, some of them have turned their warships to turn it into hospitals. They have used warplanes to carry PPEs, personal protective gears, from one side of the Atlantic to another. But they did it under pressure, under crisis. They did not do it out of wisdom and out of predicting and accepting. They had to see over 6 million people being infected, over 1.7 million people dying, before somebody getting up and say, spending national resources onto wars and missiles is not the way to protect nations. To preserve the welfare and the health of people is not to spend resources on those type of protective measures. And of course, it brings another vulnerability that we have into the fore, and that is the vulnerability of thoughts and ideology. Ideologies that prevail the global socio-economic political systems are all nationalistic, tribal. They are not inclusive, they are not global, they do not acknowledge, in a true sense, acknowledge the oneness of humankind. We still talk about race, although science has proven that there is no such a thing that the race. We have shades and colors, but they are not different races of humankind. So scientific facts have been ignored. Once again, as a result of the crisis of coronavirus, we see in all societies, science is confronted by politics, by ideology. We see politicians continuously and openly confronting scientific facts. They want to resort to other facts, other perceptions, other concepts. You can see it in the Islamic societies, you can see it in the Hindu societies, you can see it in the Christian societies, you can see in the Jewish societies, and that's another interesting phenomenon that we as human beings have to confront, and we have been forced to confront. We knew it existed, but we didn't have to bring it to the headlines of our newspapers and TV news. Nowadays, no society, neither India nor United States, nor Iran or Israel or any other country, irrespective of their religious, ideological, or cultural backgrounds, can they deny that there is this ideological fault line, ideological failure that is essentially about what we have stuck to over the past 150 years is out of kilter, is out of sync with the requirements of a global community that has grown increasingly more integrated, more interdependent, and much like a human body, we have reached to a point that no longer can we deny or ignore the fact that when one part of this body is suffering, the rest cannot prosper. The rest cannot be at peace. Well, it's taken coronavirus to highlight all of this. It's taken a global and painful experience to unite us in pain and in fear that it perhaps is time to address these issues. Perhaps it is time to recognize that protection, security, so-called strategic planning is not about more guns, more submarines, more electronic viruses against the enemies, nor is it about protecting through some kind of invisible domes. If we spend a fraction of that money that we have spent on military wear over the past 50 years, had we spent 10% of it, only 10%, we would have avoided 99% of the loss that we have suffered. If we had spent that resource, whether in the United States or in South Africa or anywhere else, if collectively we had spent 10% of what we have spent on military wear, on military budgets, if we had spent it on training nurses, building clinics, taking care of hospital equipment, and taking care of the environment, today we would not have that suffering. Of course, what I just shared with you is nothing new. Many scholars, many environmentalists, many public health experts, and so on and so forth, economists, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists have spoken about these things, and yet those in power, whether in politics or in corporate world, those who benefit from the historic structure of socio-economic and financial system, did not feel the urge to listen and to change their ways and their habits. Coronavirus has forced us to sit back and rethink. Coronavirus has brought politics, economics, trade, as well as ideology into a moment of crisis, as well as a moment of forced reimagination. I'd like to share with you what the beloved Guardian wrote in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, to just highlight that how simple and how clear the Guardian put it. He says the enormous energy dissipated and wasted on war, whether economic or political, will be consecrated to such ends as will extend the range of human inventions and technical development, to the increase of the productivity of mankind, to the extermination of disease. This was written in 1936. To the extermination of disease, to the extension of scientific research, to the raising of the standard of physical health, to the sharpening and refinement of the human brain, to the exploitation of the unused and unsuspected resources of the planet, to the prolongation of human life and to the furtherance of any other agency that can stimulate the intellectual, the moral, and the spiritual life of the entire human race. That's in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, page 205. So it is not as if humanities and humanity in general and leaders in particular were not warned of such relatively simple but very, very essential reallocation of resources that we have to do. Of course, now we got to fight another battle. As some borders have crashed, and we see our gathering today is a good example of how borders have crashed from Iran to South Africa, from United States to wherever else we choose. We can cross the boundaries without visas, but with a pin and with a link. So that is one obvious border that has been crashed. But now we got to also crush other borders, borders of military specialists who see defense, who see welfare in as a different language, in a different way, politicians who see defense of their nations one after another. They want to protect themselves as if it is possible to make Brazil great without making Zambia great. It is not possible to make the United States great without China being protected. Iran against Saudi Arabia, Israel against Egypt. The integration of human community, both from a not just economic point of view, not from a communication point of view, but from a cultural, tribal point of view, is the boundary that we have to cross. It's a border that has to be crushed. And we have likewise the issues of poverty on economic front, the borders of developed and underdeveloped, the borders of strong and weak, the borders of privileged and sidelined. A number of these borders have to be under the pressure of the current crisis and subsequent crises, have to be eliminated. And unless and until these borders are one after another set aside, not because it's politically correct, because it's systemically inevitable. You see, there's a big difference between being in a group where it's politically correct to be either progressive or liberal and say, yeah, I believe in the equality of rights of men and women. Or yes, I believe black and whites are both human beings. Yes, I believe this tribe and the other tribe, we are all human beings. Because that is a politically correct statement to make. But that is not a statement that converts perception and insight to action. We have not reached that moment yet. In fact, coronavirus has created an interesting moment of truth for us human beings. Even amongst our communities, there are not yet a full realization and full implementations of some of these basic issues of equality of human rights, in terms of human rights, in terms of access. We do it out of crisis. We are not doing it because we say, wow, the crisis showed that we got to, with immediate effect, rearrange our, for example, fiscal resources. We see, for example, countries, even the most advanced countries like EU, a good example of it. For over 50 years, they have talked about a union of Europeans. And yet, when the crisis came, Europeans set aside and let Italy and Spain have thousands upon thousands of people losing their lives in the same union. And this was only the crisis that eventually forced them last week to say, well, maybe our union was just notional but not real. We need to take it to the next stage. We need to really take care of all the members of the unions, not just the French and the Germans, or this part, not the other part. So a lot of politically correct statements, a lot of politically correct and perceived unions had to re-examine their truth, their commitment, their real commitment to sharing the resources for the welfare of all. So, in brief, what has happened over the past 5 months, we have seen a crisis that has had painful consequences, but it has also highlighted some real fault lines in the affairs of humanity. In our ecosystem, if you like, as human beings, the way we have organized our national resources, international resources, the way we have organized even United Nations and its agencies, it may have been useful in the past, and no doubt they were fruitful. They did a great deal of good for collective human welfare. And yet, over the past 30, 40 years, there has been debate that United Nations and its organizations, including World Health Organization and the rest of associated entities, are not any longer fit to take humanity's welfare forward. And the crisis over the past 5 months has brought that to a fore. Unfortunately, in a very destructive and confrontational way, but nonetheless, it has highlighted that we cannot have the United Nations and World Health Organization running the way they have been running in the past, because if they do, far from protecting us, they will land us in a global crisis of what we experience now. So being in the middle of this crisis, we see a very interesting, painful division emerging in our global community. We see that old borders are collapsing fast and furiously. And yet a new debate is emerging. I submit that from within our families and communities and nations and regions to the global level, increasingly we have to confront the following. We have to confront, do we really believe that it is possible that human beings, us, take on board the unity of mankind so fundamentally and so convincingly that we change ourselves at personal level, we rearrange our organization of the society at a national level, and we reorganize our organizations at the international level so as to have a coherent human bodies. And in that debate, in that discourse, in that titanic battle of ideas and the battle of egos, the battle of those who stand to lose historic privileges, as well as those who believe this is not sustainable, we're going to increasingly reach a moment where, as human beings, much like viruses, we have to mutate. We have to mutate, we have to evolve, either spiritually, or we go from one crisis to another crisis. And at the moment, that's the debate that is raging globally. Globally, spiritually, there are those who want to go back to normal. They want to go back to December or before. For them, back to normal means what they used to enjoy. But remember, in that world, there was a great deal of racism, there was a great deal of sexism, there was a great deal of war, there was a great deal of abuse of national resources, there was a great deal of political and corporate resources, and so on and so on and so forth. The environment was made fragile and unsustainable. If normality is that, part of the community of human beings says, no, we do not want to go to that normality. That was very abnormal. It's very abnormal for a society of human beings to call themselves human beings, but do not care for so many and perhaps the majority of people. So there's a part of us as human beings, whatever our religious orientation, whatever our cultural and tribal allegiances, we want to go back to normal, and we can't wait for that normal to come back. And there is another part of us who are arguing, no, this is a moment of crisis that should help us to mutate, to go to a more humane order, a more caring order, a more sustainable order, a more sympathetic order, a more spiritual order. And that battle increasingly is going to become more and more vivid. That line is going to be the new borders that we will find ourselves on one side of it or the other side of it. This border is now at a national level. It will become international. It will become all-embracing. And of course, it may be asked, what's the purpose of all of this? For us as Baha'is, we have had, as I mentioned, for over 140 years, not only from the revelations and tablets of Baha'u'llah and explanations of Abdul Baha during his trips to United States and Europe, and in many, many tablets, but also the beloved Guardian make it quite clear that there is a purpose in this seemingly painful and was very vividly fractured process. We see a very unprecedented, what he referred to as global convulsion around us. We see the state of the world, a mix of fantastic developments, but we also see very, very painful and regressive processes. I'm sure you're all familiar with the writings of the beloved Guardian in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, as well as many, many other places. God passes by and so on and so forth. But I'd like to share with you by way of closure as to what's the end game of this process. Is this just an accidental outbreak of a crisis that people mismanaged and it will be back to sort of, it will resolve itself, or there is a bigger picture? And I believe I happen to be that side of this border which says this is neither without purpose, nor is it conducive to the total destruction of human race. Far from it. I like to believe that it's a moment that forces all of us at personal level, at a collective level, at a national and international level, to rethink, to reimagine and reinvent ourselves, and help us hopefully mutate to a different version of ourselves that's a lot more coherent. The beloved Guardian wrote the following, that is in the World Order of Baha'u'llah. It says, in the convulsions of contemporary society, in the frenzied worldwide ebullitions of men's thoughts, in the fierce antagonisms inflaming races, creeds and classes, in the shipwreck of nations, in the downfall of kings, in the dismemberment of empires, in the extensions of dynasties, in the collapse of ecclesiastical hierarchies, in the deterioration of time-honored institutions, in the dissolution of ties, secular as well as religious, that had for so long held together the members of human race, all manifesting themselves with ever-increasing gravity. In these we can readily recognize the evidences of the travail of an age that has sustained the impact of Baha'u'llah's revelation, that has ignored his summons and is now laboring to be delivered of its burden, as a direct consequence of the impulse communicated to it by the generative, purifying, transmuting influence of his spirit. So as we reflect on these as Baha'is, as people who are concerned, we have no choice but to increasingly sharpen our own personal understanding, to get involved at a personal level, at a community level, at the international level, as well as at the institutional level, wherever we are involved. Because the purpose of what we experience, and I mentioned we are in the middle of it, by no means any one of us can say where it will end, how it will end. But what we do know, that the purpose of it is, as the Guardian mentions in the unfoldment of world civilization, and this is my closing paragraph that I'd like to share with you, the Guardian says, as we view the world around us, and it's fascinating to see, friends, that this was written in 1936, but if we forget about the date and bring it to our own experience, to me, it feels as if the beloved Guardian is explaining exactly what we experience wherever we are. He says, as we review the world around us, we are compelled to observe the manifold evidences of that universal fermentation, which in every continent of the globe and in every department of human life, be it religious, socio-economic, political, is purging and reshaping humanity in anticipation of the day when the wholeness of the human race will have been recognized and its unity established. And of course, he highlights that there are a twofold process, however, can be distinguished, each tending in its own way and with an accelerated momentum to bring to a climax the forces that are transforming the face of our planet. So the beloved Guardian quite clearly highlights that these processes that we experience is part and parcel of these twin processes of integration and disintegration that both in their own way would have to ultimately at some point fuse together and bring about the reality and operationalize the dynamics of the earth is but one country, mankind is citizens. Will it be easy? By no means. Is it inevitable? Increasingly now we see through the hammer of this crisis that it is inevitable. It is for us to engage, to personally, socially, and institutionally work with not just within our own communities, but with all like-minded people globally, in order to reimagine humanity, in order to move humanity to the next stage of its evolutionary process. And for me, that's the exciting part of it. And none of us can say we've been sidelined. All of us are invited to partake, and I'm excited about the journey ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Iraj. That was really inspiring and eyes-opening speech. I believe, as we Baha'is, we know that for every crisis there is victory. And I'm sure the way you describe the world is going to change. That's crises like COVID-19 and maybe more crises, bring humanity closer to each other, and especially the ruler of the countries. They cannot make decisions anymore by themselves because it's affecting everyone the same, especially this COVID-19. Thank you very much. Friends, the floor is open for any question. Payam Rohani. Yes.
Dr. Iraj, thank you very much for a lovely, lovely, enlightening presentation. That was a real eye-opener and it was fantastic. We really appreciate the time. I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what is to stop the world's politicians from going back to your supposed normal? What is to stop them from doing this? Because from all the blaming that you mentioned and everything else they're doing, it seems like they're heading back into the same direction and things are going to go back to the same. So what's to stop that?
Thank you very much, Fahimja. The force that will stop them, and it's not just politicians, it's also corporate leaders, it's also economic leaders who have benefited, and they have every reason to want us to take the system to where it was, because that's where how they know to amass resources. What will, in my view, what will contribute to change is a two-part answer. One is it's a divine purpose. It is that's how it's been designed to disarm them, to move it to the next stage. But if you don't like to see a sort of religious perspective or a matter of belief, let me share with you how I see the forces that will going forward will stop politicians, corporate leaders, and others who are in positions of power, including military, by the way, which is an important part of this equation, who wants to take us back to the old days. And that is about the change of the structure of power. What has happened over the past 140 years with the revelation of Baha'u'llah, increasingly institutions of power have been losing their power and stature. Power has been redefined. Power has been in many ways fundamentally shattered. And let me give you a couple of examples. For example, politicians up to recently and security people, they had the power to control borders. They stopped people from congregating and creating mass movements globally in order to challenge issues. And they had the guns, and they had the borders, and they had the police to stop it. Technology came along and changed that power. At the moment you and I can talk, and I don't know where you are, but your government and my government, my military and your military, can't stop us from having this type of congregation, creating a global movement. And this meeting that we have now is not confined to the Baha'is. There are such meetings happening across the globe, across national and religious and tribal boundaries, to create a new movement, to change the power, to take the power away from the institutions of the past and place it in the hands of human beings. Baha'u'llah says that in this revelation, power has been taken away from institutions and put with people. People have been claiming that power slowly, and the crisis of the type that we go through, and there will be more of them, all these crises chisel away, if not destroy, the power that politicians have. Do the politicians want to go back to the old ways? Without a doubt. Will they be able to do it? I believe not. Will they try? Yes. But will there be people who will mobilize across boundaries, across provinces, across the states, to force them to slow down? Absolutely. So I think what has happened in the current crisis is that people have realized that they cannot trust their leaders. They cannot trust their motives. They cannot trust their institutions of leadership. And that breakdown of trust does two things. It emboldens the individuals to not fear, to mobilize. At the same time, it weakens the other institutions. There is no single president, prime minister, or ruler in the world today who feels nearly as confident as they did 5 months ago, because they know for sure that their nation does not trust what they say. And the more they engage in sort of machinations of the past, faking or covering or whatever they do, the more they want to do things in the old way, the less they succeed, because the new power structure shows the fallacy of their engagements, the emptiness of their emotions, and the hollowness of their intentions. So the term that I'm nationalistic, that I will protect you, I have better information that you have, our military is on top of it, our national intelligence has all of it, all of these have like a balloon popped across all global nations. So that is what has changed, the changing structure of power, and it will change more and more.
Yes, thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. I had a question to just ask you to elaborate a little bit more. Towards the end of your talk, you said that the forces of integration and the forces of disintegration have to connect. I had never heard of that, so that's something that I would like to learn more a little bit about. I know that we have to always try to stay within the forces of integration and not be swayed to become, the forces of disintegration. But can you elaborate a little bit more about the connecting of them, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the term that I use is fuse, and by that I mean there are two processes, as I understand the Guardian explaining for us, is that these two processes that they have their own dynamics. For example, related to the issue that we have now, politicians want to continue the old way of running the show. Military people would want to do their own tribalist, racist, sexist, and all other orientations. They would want to do it their own way. So they will cause disruptions. They will cause distrust. They will cause social rifts and so on and so forth. And forces of integration, not just by the Baha'is, within the human community worldwide, they would want to have integrative processes. They want to be sympathetic. They want to take care of the environment. They want to take care of of children, and etc., etc. So these forces of integration, they'll do their own trajectory in parallel with the forces of disintegration, and at some point, these two will fuse. By that I mean that the forces of integration will demonstrate the sustainability, the humaneness, the credibility of doing it this way, and the forces of disintegration by themselves, they will demonstrate lack of sustainability, lack of humanity, lack of environmental acceptability, etc., etc. And that is the moment at which, or the process through which, these two processes will fuse and will ultimately, as the beloved Guardian highlights, they'll ultimately consummate in the emergence of a new world order. That's my understanding.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iraj, for that talk. What it reminded me about was that this world conflagration. We've seen the reactions of the evolution of institutions with the forming of labour unions and stuff like that to counter the evils of in the labour force, because we know that the economy of nations, the basic element is human beings. So do you see that this will be the germination of not a national level of labour union, but maybe a global process?
Yeah, very much so. I think these are the, as quite aptly you put it, these are germination times on so many fronts. So many seeds are being sown. At the labor side is one side of it, but there is another side in all spheres of human life. One of the interesting phenomenon or experiences that we've had as human beings over the past 5 months is that the countries that have been led by women have been most successful in dealing with the crisis, minimizing the human loss. Suddenly it has germinated or put a seed, a thought in the minds of political gurus, political scientists and sociologists as to why. Now, as you recall, Abdul Baha'i in Paris talks and in many other places highlights the point that the welfare of human nations and the unity of humankind will not be possible until women assume their rightful position in socio-economic and political governance of the society. Now, this remained a sort of ideal, some religious Baha'is talking about it, but nobody could prove it. Nobody could scientifically or genetically say, well, what is in women that would would make it happen? Now, look back at the 5 months, what suddenly has happened. Countries both in the East and the West, they have demonstrated, and it cannot be by accident, that all countries that had women leadership, including in your neighborhood, New Zealand, had a much better success than others. And it didn't have to do with how developed or underdeveloped they are, how big their army is, or how big their medical fraternity exists. So it's a very interesting experiment that will germinate into the minds of the political scientists, sociologists, and strategists going forward as to perhaps not only at a national level, but also at a local level. And we see in the United States and elsewhere, where women are mayor and mayoresses, they've got a better success in mobilizing and in caring and demonstrating care, not talking about care. We men seem to be talking about care far more than we know how to do it. So they have demonstrated that what Abdul Baha told us many decades ago, or more than 100 years ago, is now germinates in the minds of all of us as human beings. Likewise in the labor issue. Very importantly, another germination that is, and I'm building on your notion, Jeff, what this crisis does is exactly it sows new seeds that we hadn't thought about it, or we had thought about, but we've sort of underplayed its importance. in so many spheres of our life, in economic life, in trade. For example, up to recently, and I mean up to a year ago, the notion was that China is the manufacturing hub of the globe and everybody else must just buy it from China because it's cheaper, and you mustn't worry about their human rights and labor rights. Comparative prices means they produce cheaper, we must buy it and close down our own local manufacturing. Well, it's now being proven that that's not perhaps quite the right way to do. In South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where I live and where I have some involvement in these policy processes, there are serious rethink that price is not the only consideration. Price cannot be the only consideration. Labor rights matter, employability matters, access to resources matters. So simply because something is cheaper, it doesn't mean that we should close down the local one, because access becomes important. Availability when you need it becomes important. So we need to rethink so many of our ways of doing business, doing employment, believing and living our socio-political life, including who the leaders should be. What do we put in place that when they say something, we can trust them? How do we rebuild trust in our leadership? Corporate leaders have also come short in the process. So anyhow, I do not want to continue this, but the point that you make is absolutely on. It's a process of germination of so many seeds that have either been sown or were sown but now being nourished and watered, and in time they will lead to new ways of running our personal, community and international ways of socio-economic and political life.
Iraj, in that situation, you mentioned about how individually we need to have this new understanding of how we have to, what was the word you used? Morph. We need to morph into a different, more compassionate being from the individual. But from what I understand as well, our institutions, this is a time where our institutions themselves need to demonstrate to the world the application of these teachings, not as a spiritual teaching, but as a practical way, the Baha'u'llah says, to evolve into a world community. So I'm just wondering how we can play our part in forming our own institutions, like our own assemblies, our own communities, how we are to respond to this. This is what's impacting on me as to how do I implement myself in my community.
Yeah, I mean, it is my understanding, I'm sure other friends have their own views and most probably more mature understanding of it, but my understanding is that over the past few decades, the House of Justice has highlighted that we have the three protagonists. We have the individual, we have the community and institutions. And as we engage in these processes, our community becomes no longer just community of the Baha'is, it becomes the community of interested group, interest in what we want to do. Whether they are Baha'is or not is totally irrelevant. Do they share, do we have like-minded individual? And I would, this is my personal, I guess, notion, we must also move from like-minded to like-hearted people who are prepared to join forces with us in order to create a community of activists who care about the welfare of humanity. And the longer and the larger and the deeper that community becomes, community of like-minded and like-hearted people, I have absolutely no doubt that institutions will have to respond to it. We have had examples in some parts of the world where when the community of like-minded and like-hearted have grown beyond the proportion, the local municipality couldn't just ignore it. The local chief or local political leadership could no longer ignore it. I like to believe that in whatever country that we live, if you get a critical mass of like-minded people gravitating and mobilizing around certain issues, the political establishment will respond, will have to respond. That is the nature, the dynamic of power. And the more peaceful we do it, the better they'll respond and the quicker we'll see the result. That is how I see the process unfolding.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sharon?
Thank you.
Sharon?
Alapa, Raj, thank you so much for a very educational talk. And in Australia, there has been, and thank you for talking about the World Health Organization and the United Nations. There's been a use of a term that I've struggled with. They've been talking about the New World Order. Even in Australia, there's a media site that refers to camping ground restrictions because we are now in the New World Order. Is this going on globally? Is this, personally, I feel this is a misappropriation of Baha'i writings that I have a problem with. Is this going on around the world, or is this something here? And can you please talk to that? And
yeah, Sharon, if you worried about it personally, I think don't worry, because this misappropriation, and I'm an economist, and as a student of economics, I got very excited and almost anxious and angry when back in 1970s a group of economists at an international level, they talked about the New World Order, and what they put together was a trade system that was better than what we had, but it was nothing close to, as a Baha'i, you would define as New World Order. So I stayed sort of anxiously angry for about a couple of years, as I resonate with your feelings. So that fashion came and went, and that New World Order collapsed, so to speak. The architects of those trade concepts couldn't make their concept come stuck, if you like, theoretically and technically, institutionally. Was their idea correct? Yeah, they knew that the old order that we had wasn't good. We must think of New World Order. Today people talk about New World Order. Do they mean the same thing as the Guardian means? Absolutely not. And some of them actually abuse it, because by New World Order they say, well, we mustn't allow migrants in because it's a New World Order. I mean, that's an absolute antithesis of what the Guardian talks about the New World Order, or Baha'u'llah talks about the New World Order. So that too, in my view, is part of the process of far being anxious about it. The fact that there are people who think the old order is just not acceptable for whatever reason. We need a new world order. The question is, what is the definition and boundaries of this new world order? That is where you and I come in to engage, to constructively and really spiritually, patiently, without getting either excited or anxious or anything of the sort, to engage with these fellow human beings. That we cannot appropriate, never mind misappropriate, the plan of God. We can either align ourselves with it through human rationality and human experimentation, or we can fight it. Whether you are this side of the line or that side of the line, at some point these two have to fuse. And I just, for what is worth, Sharon, relax, and this is not a serious thing at all. Be excited, but engage with them to say, what does New World Order mean from your point of view? And let's have a discussion.
so possibly I could look at it as a way of a seeding of a concept into collective consciousness that will bear fruit in alignment with Baha'i principles.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's, I mean, Sharon, I have in my life, I've been privileged to have had direct engagements, discussions with our political leaders, our thought leaders in the society, across political lines. And again, by way of, if it helps, that we mustn't worry, is when apartheid collapsed, One of the notions that South Africa was very successful in putting an image through Archbishop Tutu was the notion of a rainbow nation, and unity of races and communities and so on, which was a wonderful concept. And I said, it's a wonderful concept, but it's not good enough, because we need to deal with the immunity problem that our society has. So rainbow nation, unity in diversity and so on, these are wonderful slogans, but we need to say, okay, what does it mean on the ground? Does it mean that we're taking care of the poor? Do we provide protection for them, for their health and for their housing and schooling and policing, etc., etc.? If not, then it becomes a problematic notion. So, but it was a wonderful opportunity to say, let's talk about unity in diversity from a different perspective, not from a political sloganeering point of view, but from a content and substance point of view. And that created opportunity to share the faith with many people, share writings of the House of Justice, etc., etc. Some of them threw it away, some of them embraced it, some of them up to today, they engage with it. But that's fine, that's part of the process, that's our role. I see us, if the world is a big dough that has to somehow mature, somehow ferment and get ready for baking, we got to see ourselves as the leaven, as we just drop here, and we don't have to be many. The proportion of leaven to the dough is very low, but it's the role that it plays which matters. As long as we are active, we will release the enzymes and the thought processes that we can't control, and we shouldn't try to control, because it's not our job. Our job is to just throw the seeds and activate those enzymes and leave it to the bigger forces to sort it out.
Beautiful. Thank you for that metaphor. That's beautiful.
Thank you, and I appreciate Iraj. That was wonderful speech, very comprehensive speech, and I believe everyone has enjoyed as much as I did. Friends, thank you so much for attending this session.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Bye-bye.